Larian's Baldur's Gate 3 was nothing shy of a miracle. It swept Game of the Year awards, reintroduced many to computer RPGs, and is now a strong contender for Game of the Generation. But 20 years prior, a different Baldur's Gate 3 was in development, this time with Interplay's Black Isle Studios and with the subtitle The Black Hound. The Black Hound has long been shrouded in mystery, more often overshadowed by its sister project Fallout Van Buren, the two previous entries in the series from Bioware, and nowadays by its newer namesake. But the story of Black Isle's Baldur's Gate is more than anything, the story of the strongest voices in role-playing trying to save a dying company, and the nearly 2 decades spent trying to pick up the pieces. This is the untold story of Baldur's Gate 3: The Black Hound. In 1995, Bioware was a small studio just starting out. Every few months, the team would come down from Alberta, Canada to Irvine, California to show their prototype RPG engine to Interplay manager Feargus Urquhart. On their last meeting, Bioware would tell Urquhart that they were taking their prototype to a different publisher, but wanted to show it off one last time. Urquhart's only note was simple: how about instead we make this a Dungeons & Dragons game? Over the next few years, Bioware and Urquhart's newly formed developer under Interplay Black Isle Studios would use their exclusive license to the most popular tabletop game to start a golden age of computer RPGs, using Bioware's prototype dubbed the Infinity Engine to do it. By 1999, Black Isle Studios was the house the Infinity Engine had built, with a young and ambitious team setting out to make the games they wanted to play. At this time, both Black Isle and Interplay as a whole had management that was willing to accommodate this mentality, not just from Urquhart, but also then Interplay CEO Brian Fargo. Year after year, they'd produce some of the best PC RPGs on the market, not just by supporting Bioware with Baldur's Gate, but also with Planescape Torment and a new entry in Interplay's hit new franchise separate from the Infinity Engine and D&D, Fallout. But the 2D engine was beginning to show its age. For their next D&D game, Neverwinter Nights, Bioware would develop their new Aurora 3D engine, while Black Isle, who was starting work on Fallout Van Buren, which was covered on this channel in 2023, and a new Forgotten Realms D&D project under the working title of Jefferson, would switch to a new 3D engine from NDL. The tech, however, proved hard to work with. While this was happening, Interplay was struggling, unable to make payments on accumulating debt, and desperately trying to survive in the rapidly growing home console market. In early 1999, French publisher Titus Interactive moved in, buying up 12% of the company and helping Interplay make ends meet. Almost immediately, there'd be a cultural shift. Titus was primarily the publisher of smaller-scale license titles for home consoles that were, at best, forgotten and at worst thrown into the sun by the angry video game nerd. Black Isle, despite being the most profitable team under Interplay, would begin to feel a squeeze. Titus's interests were more in taking Interplay's successes to home consoles, as they saw the future of gaming being less and less focused on the PC. Following the cancellation of a Dreamcast port of Baldur's Gate 1, Interplay under Titus would enlist Snowblind Interactive to develop an action RPG tie-in to the series on the PlayStation 2 named Dark Alliance. Between Black Isle's trouble with their new engine and Interplay's shifting goals, both Jefferson and Van Buren would be pushed back in favor of Icewind Dale, which was intended to have a quick turnaround and stay in the Infinity Engine while Black Isle developed new tech internally. To lead designer Chris Avallone, who was working on both projects, this was a bad sign. Black Isle had thrived on these interesting takes on CRPGs, but until that new engine was finished, they were instead only working within the confines of Bioware's technology, and never actually pushing the envelope. It felt like they were no longer making the games they wanted to play. The other sides of Interplay were struggling as well, and in late 2001, just a few months before the release of Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, Titus Interactive would purchase another 40% of the company, giving them a complete controlling stake of Interplay. When Dark Alliance would be released that December, however, it was a huge hit, proving that the PlayStation 2 may hold a profitable future for the company. But as was usually the case with Interplay, that success was accompanied by new problems. Originally, Bioware's new 3D Dungeons & Dragons game Neverwinter Nights was going to be published by Interplay. However, while development was ongoing, Infogrames/Atari acquired Hasbro Interactive, giving them a say in the future of D&D games. Interplay as well would part ways with CEO Brian Fargo and offload their North American distribution rights to Vivendi to help with their continued financial problems. This change, however, was done without the knowledge or consent of Bioware, and the Canadian studio would sue Interplay over breach of contract. It's admittedly a bit tricky to iron out the details of a case this old that largely took place behind closed doors. However, what is known is that it resulted in Interplay losing the rights to publish Neverwinter Nights to Atari. What's implied based on interviews from developers over the years was that Interplay renegotiated the terms of the license to accommodate no longer publishing Bioware's game, their now in development sequel to Icewind Dale, and the console-forward future of the company. With Atari publishing Neverwinter Nights, Interplay's license was technically no longer exclusive, and so they would agree to sell off the rights to everything D&D related that wasn't Baldur's Gate or Icewind Dale on the PC for future rights to console games. Going forward, Project Jefferson, their new D&D game they were finally in a position to start work on, would have to be named either Icewind Dale 3 or Baldur's Gate 3, regardless of where in the Forgotten Realms it actually took place. And with its focus on role-playing rather than dungeon crawling, it would be dubbed the latter, Baldur's Gate 3: The Black Hound. In the far east of Faerun, just outside the town of Whiteford, a black hound crawls into your lap and dies. Its killer, a bandit named Mayfarrow, has been hunted across the Dalelands, driven mad by her pursuit of the hound and the desire to resurrect her husband whose death she caused. When the hound lands in your lap, its spirit bonds with you, showing you the guilt of those around you. Pharaoh, seeing it die in your arms, believes you're in league with the hound and attacks you before being chased off by the riders of Arkandale. The riders, on the other hand, believe you're working with Pharaoh and enlist you to instead bring her to justice. However, the many factions on this side of the country want Pharaoh for their own selfish needs, seeing her power as the key to controlling the region. To the Red Wizards of Thay, that means establishing a foothold in the Dalelands, pushing their influence east. To the Silver Ravens of Symbia, however, who've long had control of this part of Faerun, the pursuit of Pharaoh drives them into a nationalistic fury in order to protect their homeland. In the middle of it is you, an adventurer who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, bonded to a metaphysical spirit of guilt, and trying to stop Mayfarrow before she resurrects her dead husband and turns him into an unholy creation. Throughout the story of the Black Hound, the theme of guilt and absolution arises, but this would also bleed into gameplay. Your party would be united with you to absolve their own forms of guilt, and your actions or even inactions in the world were designed to have a real tangible effect on not just the region, but also your companions, with a detailed reputation and influence system similar to what was seen a few years later in Black Isle's successor Obsidian's Knights of the Old Republic 2. This was also coupled with a sense of true non-linearity, with open-ended design intended to be an evolution for these types of games, with side quests that dovetailed across multiple regions, and with unique solutions in an unprecedented manner for the time. Designer Damien Folletto, in an interview with Winterwind Productions, would give one example of helping magistrates with their financial problems in one area, impacting the economy of another. The world of the Black Hound was intended to feel real, and you're always making some form of wave. These waves, however, would also be pushing beyond just the confines of Baldur's Gate 3, with this intended as part 1 of a new trilogy, with your player character only gaining the first 8 levels and growing more powerful in the next entry. This is something that's only really been attempted a handful of times, having been an option between the previous 2 Baldur's Gates, but was also being done 5 years before the most famous example, Mass Effect. There is a bit of a question on whether or not the combat was purely turn-based or real-time with pause seen in previous Baldur's Gate games. Folletto specifically cites his own love of turn-based games when discussing the Black Hound's innovations, and it is known that there was some debate between Black Isle and Interplay higher-ups, with Interplay citing the trends at the time, pointing to a more real-time future. Inside the Van Buren tech demo that used the same engine and was leaked not long after its cancellation, a switch between the 2 types of combat can be seen. but it's unclear how far along this feature really was. However, despite its crude state, that leaked tech demo does show the Jefferson engine in action, albeit in a different context. And for the time, it looks impressive, with better lighting and more options for character customization and camera setups, and a back-end scripting that could accommodate that open design style. While there's something lost in the move away from the gorgeous pre-rendered look of Black Isle's previous games, as it feels similar to the aesthetics lost in the jump from the SNES to N64, 3D was fully the name of the game, and the things that came with it were a requirement to be competitive in the market. What we have on our hands then is a game that is wholly ahead of its time, improving on Black Isle's best concepts in a way only a studio at the top of its game could, with a more future-proofed engine and ideas that wouldn't be seen for another 2, 5, or even 20 years, all being done in spite of waning interest in the genre. But while work continued for another 6-ish months, everything would go quiet in 2003. The exact reason for the Black Hound's cancellation is a little opaque, but both Urquhart and Avalon would call it, quote, an accounting error on Interplay's part. Folletto would instead point to Interplay sacrificing the PC D&D license in order to keep one on consoles. However, it sort of seems like both are true. By 2003, Interplay was starting to get sloppy. It seemed they technically didn't have the rights to the Snowblind engine they were using for both Dark Alliance 2 and Fallout Brotherhood of Steel. By failing to pay proper royalties, Atari was forced to step in, once again relitigating Interplay's future rights to the license. While the suit between Interplay and Snowblind wouldn't be formally filed until November 2003, and the license wasn't nullified until that December, it's my personal speculation that when it was discovered they didn't have the rights to the engine, either by Interplay, Atari, or Snowblind itself, the publishers told the team that they'd made an error and were canceling BG3 in order to protect Dark Alliance 2. This falls in line with Interplay only delaying the PS2 game when litigation began, rather than canceling it as well, and then managing to renegotiate a release for DA2 the following year. Despite the Black Hound being very far along, and a sequel to one of Interplay's most successful games, no new deal for its release would be negotiated. What is known outright, though, is that in early 2003, Baldur's Gate 3 would be cancelled, and the mass exodus would begin.
The cancellation had nothing to do with how hard you were working on the project, or how passionate people are about it. It's because someone else messed up. And you're like, well, if that's how it's gonna be, then the chances of having future projects at Black Isle are not very likely.
Feargus Urquhart and Chris Avalon would be the first to leave in early 2003, both citing the frustration felt with Interplay's inability or unwillingness to fight for the license. They, alongside Darren Monahan, Chris Parker, and Chris Jones, would start their own studio, Obsidian Entertainment. The handful that stayed behind, including designers Josh Sawyer and Damian Folletto, would be transferred to Fallout 3, codenamed Van Buren. Over the next few months, however, Interplay's troubles worsened, and those who didn't leave outright by the end of 2003 would be laid off in December, effectively closing Black Isle for good. Interplay would spend much of 2004 in a death rattle, failing to pay rent, workers' comp insurance, and payroll taxes until they'd be forced to close by the state. Titus would go bankrupt not long after, selling off much of their assets to a now on life support version of Interplay, who has done little other than continue to sell off their biggest IPs to avoid bankruptcy, cancel projects like their Fallout MMO, and re-release their old titles. For Baldur's Gate, both original Fallout developer Tim Kaine at Troika Games and Brian Fargo at his new studio InXile would try to get the license, but due in part to troubles at Atari, neither would get off the ground. In a lot of ways, it feels like the team at the newly formed Obsidian never really missed a beat. Now independent, the team of about 7 would start their new studio doing what they did best, following in Bioware's footsteps. After pitching a Star Wars action RPG to Lucasfilm using the Snowblind engine, which they ironically actually had permission for, the team were instead offered the Knights of the Old Republic sequel Bioware had passed on. In late 2003, Bioware would come down to the Obsidian office, which was really just Urquhart's finished attic, to hand off their technology. In the 8 years since showing Urquhart their prototype Infinity engine, a lot had changed. Bioware had become one of the most successful developers of RPGs, now beginning work on their own franchises, and the team at Obsidian were back to square one, forced to start over, and once again working within the confines of Bioware's tech. For what it's worth, KOTOR 2 is both a great sequel and a great game in its own right, even despite its rushed state, a sort of Empire Strikes Back to Bioware's A New Hope. It also features a version of the Black Hound's influence system and a similar exploration of guilt. Your player character is a Jedi exile who detonated a superweapon to defeat the Mandalorians, becoming a wound in the Force, a sort of vacuum of the pain and suffering experienced at your hands that a new generation of Sith are feeding off of. Your companions, many of whom feature connections to this incident, can be influenced by your actions to become either dark or light side Force users, guided along their path by the choices you make. People still talk about the complicated role-playing and the interesting exploration of the Star Wars universe in KOTOR 2 to this day. It's often cited as some of Chris Avalone's best work specifically, and so it's interesting to see how this idea grew from his and the rest of the team's time on the Black Hound. After KOTOR 2, however, Bioware had also decided to pass on Neverwinter Nights 2. Obsidian would take over in 2004, with many of the team returning to the Forgotten Realms once again. Neverwinter Nights 2 isn't to the Black Hound what Fallout New Vegas was to Fallout Van Buren. It was much more of a direct sequel to Bioware's work, but that didn't mean their lost Baldur's Gate wasn't on their mind. In fact, a year after the release of Nights 2, while Obsidian was working on DLCs, Alpha Protocol, and their Alien RPG, Atari would ask if they wanted to give Baldur's Gate another go. Throughout most of 2008, Urquhart and team put together a pitch deck for a game that was of a similar type and scale to games like Dragon Age and Mass Effect, with more of a focus on exploration in different parts of Faerun. With work on the Alien RPG stalled by the fall, Obsidian now had the personnel to work on the project. Despite the effort, however, Atari would start to give Obsidian the runaround until all of Atari Europe was sold off in mid-2009 to Bandai Namco. Suddenly, the producer who'd been the main point of contact was gone, and the project fell through. Their work on the proprietary Onyx engine and pre-production ideas would instead be shopped to other publishers, with Square Enix offering them the license to Dungeon Siege instead. While again, Dungeon Siege 3 isn't the Black Hound, some of the broader strokes of the story feel similar. The main antagonist, Jane Cassinder in particular, feels very similar to the ideas from May Pharaoh. Both are focused on an unholy resurrection, with Cassinder wanting to return the old gods to the region, and both are now the focus of many of the game's political factions. Game development is messy, and while Urquhart himself was more involved in Dungeon Siege 3 than most other games at Obsidian, it was never intended as the original BG3 team getting a chance to try again, as it was mostly headed up by the new crop of talent that had come on board as Obsidian grew. The new studio had taken on a life of its own, and Dungeon Siege's connection to the Black Hound were likely just some ideas that were rattling around the office, or even, though unlikely, just a coincidence. Dungeon Siege 3's goals were much more focused on making sure the work prototyping their Alien RPG and Baldur's Gate 3 pitch didn't go to waste. This is made doubly obvious by the fact that Josh Sawyer was, around this time, instead working on a fan module adaptation for the Black Hound within Neverwinter Nights 2. Which would never see the light of day, as NWN2 wasn't complex enough to accommodate the original vision, and, I personally speculate, work on Fallout New Vegas was starting up as well. To be honest, not a lot of canceled games get to have the original team take another crack at it, and rework many of their ideas. While the former Black Isle devs never got the chance for the Black Hound, it's safe to say that they were, at the very least, very lucky to have that opportunity to revisit some of Van Buren and New Vegas. Despite their successes, however, by 2012, Obsidian was hurting. Their big Xbox exclusive Stormlands had been canceled, and the future of the studio wasn't looking bright.
Hi Kickstarters, I'm Feargus Urquhart, the founder of Black Isle Studios and the CEO and founder of Obsidian Entertainment. We're excited to talk to you today about Project Eternity, which is a whole new fantasy role-playing game that we're making here at Obsidian, and with Kickstarter and you, we can make this a reality.
Seeing the successes that studios like Double Fine and Brian Fargo's new company InXile had with Kickstarter, and motivated by the nostalgia fans had for the days of the Infinity Engine, lead programmer Adam Bernecki, who joined the studio during the development of KOTOR 2, would pitch Project Eternity, a new isometric RPG that, most importantly, was an original IP that Obsidian owned and had strong ties to their roots. While these types of Kickstarters were becoming more and more common, the crowdfunding campaign for the game that would become Pillars of Eternity was a huge success for the company. raising $4 million and helping to prove that these types of games still had a fan base, even if publishers were unwilling to take a risk on them. Over the next few years, a number of new and former studios would begin crowdfunding their own CRPGs, creating an admittedly very full niche that led to some truly great games, including perhaps most famously, Larian's Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2. Despite this new revitalization, very little word would come regarding new CRPG Dungeons & Dragons games. In 2012, however, a new studio, Beamdog, founded by early Bioware developers, would begin work on enhanced editions of the original 2 Baldur's Gate games, and would return to the Infinity Engine to do so. Not only that, they would also announce new original DLC designed to bridge the gap between the 2 games, with the eventual goal of proving themselves worthy to work on a third entry. Images of a new Baldur's Gate 3 in the Infinity Engine began to swirl, returning to old tech to make a game that felt like a true successor rather than a modern reinterpretation felt like an easy sell. By 2018, this started to seem like it was a sure thing when Brian Fargo would tweet out that someone was working on Baldur's Gate 3. Speculation circulated that it was either Beamdog or Fargo's company InXile. After all, Fargo had previously trademarked the names of other famously cancelled Interplay games and had created 2 sequels to Wasteland nearly 30 years after the original. It was very much in InXile's wheelhouse. In Belgium, however, another player had arisen in Larian Studios. Shortly after the release of their own crowdfunded RPG Divinity Original Sin in 2014, CEO Sven Vincke had approached D&D parent company Wizards of the Coast to pitch a new Baldur's Gate. Wizards of the Coast, however, wasn't interested, citing them being a studio that was too small and too new for a game of this scale. Rumors in 2018 on RPG Codex, however, showed that somewhere along the line this had changed, and that Larian had managed to get the license at some point over the last 4 years. It seemed that during the pre-release hype of the second Original Sin, Wizards of the Coast reached back out, and Larian would start work on their Baldur's Gate 3. While I'm sure in the context of this video it seems like Larian was a bit of a dark horse, over the past 10 years they had become a very strong voice in this market. The newer Divinity games had been among the best in the CRPG boom of the 2010s, and a new third Baldur's Gate game in their style was welcomed by fans. At E3 2019, 15 years after the cancellation of the Black Hound, Larian would announce the subtitle-less Baldur's Gate 3 at the Google Stadia press conference, going into early access the following year and releasing 1.0 in 2023. For what it's worth, Baldur's Gate 3 is much more of a sequel to BioWare's work than the Black Hound ever was, with the occasional returning character and a setting actually in the same region. That being said, it's very much a Larian game, while also trying to adapt the feeling of playing 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons in video game form. I'm hard-pressed to think of another game that actually shows you rolling the dice like this, which is a really nice touch. That being said, while its connections to the Black Hound are tenuous, they aren't non-existent. For one, its choice to go fully turn-based connects more heavily with Black Isle's own ideas, intending to break tradition in favor of doing what felt like the right fit for capturing that D&D experience and continuing what they did best. Funnily enough as well, the psychic mind flayer tadpole that inhabits your player character feels sort of like the idea of the spiritual Black Hound in Black Isle's work, the way it connects and unites your party first and foremost, and how it will often offer the occasional insight into the motivations of various NPCs. While the story of Baldur's Gate 3 as a whole is a little more about the Mind Flayer threat and a little less about the absolution of guilt and our relationship with it, it still doesn't shy away from giving you meaningful characters and companions to connect with, even if the Mind Flayer and Black Hound parallels are just a funny coincidence. Additionally, Baldur's Gate 3 is a hugely reactive game, with decisions branching out and having long-term effects on the party in unexpected ways, and allowing the player to think creatively to solve problems. It feels like both Black Isle and Larian came to the same conclusion 20 or so years apart, like they looked at that era of CRPGs and wanted to do more, wanted to let the players find their own adventures and make waves in their own way that made them feel like they mattered. It's obvious that Larian was a huge fan of BioWare and Black Isle's work, and wanted to make a game that was distinctly theirs, but also a loving tribute to the age of the Infinity Engine, in a time when challenging, open-ended, and player-driven Dungeons & Dragons games were king. I've covered a lot of canceled games on this channel, and none of them have been almost happening as often as Baldur's Gate 3. Even the ones that managed to come out in some form are compromised, limping over the line, or just unrecognizable from the strong ideas that they started with. Baldur's Gate 3, however, feels lucky. It was like it was this driving force in the industry, a bit of unfinished business that the strongest voices in gaming dreamed of making. While Larian ended up on top and made an incredible game, in the aftermath of its original cancellation, it's hard to not think about all the other great games that we got because of it as well. There's no spiritual representation of guilt anymore, just incredible games from passionate creators.